within and across social contexts and intentions. But what we have in our test is a brittle and antique notion of bilingualism, which is rooted in the sort of notion of language state, citing Hobsbawm. Language learning, according to Fairclough, is mastery of a unitary, determinate practice that people can be trained in. And in a way, I think that is what is happening. Why? I'm going to argue that it actually isn't in the chain of inferences in the test itself. That something else is intervening, interrupting the communication of language policy with the language tests. And that something is the standards. We talked about fidelity. A test, if it is to be considered, if we are to draw valid inferences from the test, we must reflect fidelity. And here, this test is reflecting fidelity to the standards. These standards were articulated largely in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. They are representative of a time when the models of language in the standards were informed by monolingual constructs, when we actually had a large number of monolinguals running about. We don't have them anymore. Try to find monolinguals. I've been surveying my students in my Canadian classroom for the past 10 years, and I see an increasing decline in the number of students who report they are monolinguals. It's moved from 7% 5 years ago to 3%, based on about 3,000 students. 3% self-identify as monolinguals. Think about it. So, what I'm seeing here, and if we look at the program for this conference, I think you see this as an increasing trend, is something that Kane didn't visualize, something that Kane really didn't consider when he was developing the chain of inference. I think there is a gap now between mandate and purpose, as it is defined, and policies that define standards, proficiency frameworks, frameworks of reference. Those standards are now becoming the constructs. And so we have another bull in the china shop. Not only the test, but needs interrogation, but also standards as policy initiatives. Whether it is the CEFR, Canadian European Framework of Reference, Canadian language benchmarks, proficiency frameworks and guidelines, or the standards that are articulated for the Public Service Commission by the Government of Canada, we need to begin to interrogate the standards because they are policy initiatives. And in the case of the SLE is bound to represent the standards that have been they have inherited. The standards are translating this very rich policy of official bilingualism. But the standards, I think, are narrowing that definition to a point where they are distorting our potential to measure authentic and real bilingualism as it manifested itself in of my potential to measure authentic and real bilingualism as it manifested itself in the conversation of my colleague at the Ministry of Education in Seychelles, and as it lives every day in the offices and corridors and elevators and washrooms of the Government of Canada. In addition, Then there's also this issue of bilingual classification. I think one of the things that goes along with the standards is how we classify positions as bilingual. And I know that there is work afoot to look at needs analysis, to collect data and evidence of what is actually going on in offices in terms of establishing bilingual classifications. I'm not alone in seeing a gap here between the lofty goals of the Official Languages Act and the largely instrumental sense in which too many public servants view language training and testing. It's been reported on in the literature. And I think the most fundamental thing here with regard to construct definition is to look at what is being written about in terms of the use of first languages in second and foreign language learning. And here we can draw on the work of Turnbull and Daly O'Kane, where they, at the end of their book, say we need to begin envisioning learners not as ineffective and imperfect monolinguals of the monolingual speakers of the target language, but as aspiring bilinguals. I think our construct has changed and it needs to be reflected, but I think the standards must change in the context of the SLE before anything can happen. I think we all know about the negative washback. It's widely reported in the literature. Here are some examples of construct underrepresentation. Manager reporting, if we need to write something in French, something important, we ask one of our French-speaking colleagues to write it. Then we review. On the job, I just wouldn't waste time writing it myself. A policy analyst. Here, another more evidence of construct underrepresentation. At a meeting, I speak French at times, but I listen a lot in French. I always feel comfortable. A clerk receptionist. We use both English and French, like at the same time. It just works that way. And washback, here's some negative washback. I passed the test, I got my C's. Now I just don't use French at all. It's a shame, really. All that time and effort, but I just don't have a place to use it. It's just not part of my workplace, you know. And from a teacher teaching in relation to the test, this, I think, is something to really think about very carefully. The comment, since I've been teaching, I feel more and more on the defensive about being a Québécoise, you know? Like my French isn't as good as the French coming from outside. That's really, really fundamentally, that hits me in the gut. Because, you know, in terms of our policy, this is not where we want to be. Forgot which one to click. Now, this is why I wanted to split the washback from the impact. Because if we look for evidence of positive impact, we see it in Canada. I see it every day in my students, and I know you see it in yours. It's everywhere. Look at the educational preferences of Canadian parents. Holy crow. We really had set up a wave. We cannot accommodate all the requests for bilingual education. They're coming from everywhere, from across Canada. And it's really hard, as I said before, to find anybody who identifies now as a monolingual in Canada. Right? Everyone has some degree of exposure to English and French. You know, there are fewer and fewer monolinguals out there. They may not actively use the language, but they have a knowledge of it, and that knowledge could be cultivated and could develop in the right circumstances. I want to very briefly, like in about 3 minutes, mention a couple of other policy initiatives that I think are very interesting. And now my characterization changes from a raging bull. I was sort of limited in clip art to a raging bull or Ferdinand the Bull. I wanted just to suggest in connection with the portfolio-based language assessment that this is a more Ferdinand type initiative. It has real potential. to add value. That's the flower. And it's a nicely controlled, anyway, sympathetic. And this is an initiative in the LINK program, as I mentioned, and I think it's representative of what researchers like Colby Kelly and Turner have argued for, the making connections between constructs and assessment that support unique learner-centered learning in relation to systematic collections of evidence and reliable assessment, or assessment for learning. So in sum, I think we need to reevaluate operational definitions of literacy and acknowledge literacy as a shifting digital construct. We need to make that sort of recognition, and that needs to be acknowledged in the context of the OSSLT. I think we must be on our guard as a community of language with all of this pooled and collective language expertise, to look very carefully at standards and proficiency frameworks and benchmarks, and that includes the CLB and the CEFR, because they are, in effect, constructs that then define what will be translated on tests. And so they're not part of that circle that Kane identified in terms of considerations of validity at the chain of inference, but I think they are a very important, and I would suggest sometimes very weak, chain in the chain of inference. And again, the test is only going to be as strong as the weakest link in the chain of inference. I think we need to recognize Canada's evolving plurilinguistic reality and value and support plurilingualism. We need to avoid what I'm doing this morning, which is preaching to the choir. Somehow, we've got to get the message out to decision makers, the people that are in positions of power. We don't tend to be able to reach them. We keep talking to ourselves and amongst ourselves, and we all agree, right? Or we agree more or less. That makes it interesting. We debate and we continue to move forward, but we're not we're not reaching the people that really have the power to make the changes and control the process. We need to increase our understanding and recognize the potential of diagnostic assessment and assessment for learning. We need a National Association of Language Testers and Assessors, and we have, in fact, formed one. We're 3 years old, and I would invite all of you that are coming to Fredericton for the conference at the beginning of June, Canadian Association of Applied Linguistics. We will be having our 3rd annual meeting there. And perhaps these issues and some of the, a brief, I think this will give us a platform as language testers and assessors to speak with a voice that can influence and reach some of the policymakers to make changes, to influence policy as it is, currently, as it currently exists. And please watch for an upcoming call for papers. There will be a special issue of Language Assessment Quarterly, which is looking at language assessment and testing in Canada. So I'm really looking forward to working on the development of that issue. And that's the end. Thank you.